This is a Radical Exchange production. Hello and welcome to Radical Exchanges. Today, Matt has a conversation with Frank McCourt, the founder of Project Liberty, an initiative working to decentralize the internet and restructure our digital infrastructure around human rights principles. Frank draws parallels to television's early public oversight, articulates how our full personhoods have become the exploited product, and makes the case for why new protocols and a movement informed by past struggles against oppressive systems are critical to giving individuals true data rights and agency online. The dialogue explores Frank's vision for reclaiming the internet, and Project Liberty is a very important project to watch in the next few years, so it's useful to hear how Frank is thinking. Without further ado, here's Matt Prewitt and Frank McCourt.
Frank McCourt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, Matt. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. A little sick, actually, from extensive travel, but hanging in there.
Well, yeah, we'll have a good conversation. You'll feel better.
Super. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, can you say a little bit more about, or a little bit about your inspiration for starting Project Liberty? What inspired you to undertake this journey, and what are you seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, I wrote Our Biggest Fight to shed light on Project Liberty and some of the reasons I got into the work and why I think it's so fundamentally important and actually urgent. And I think part of it, Matt, comes from kind of a hard wiring. I grew up in a big family. I'm one of 7 sibs in Watertown, Massachusetts, a town just outside of Boston, and we were all like many families at the dinner table. We were able to share lots of opinions and have lots of great conversation, and very different opinions, as a matter of fact. And me and my sibs were pretty good at identifying problems, though, as most kids are. And not a dinner would end without my mom saying, "Okay, kids, you've done a good job of like identifying the problem. Now what are you going to do about it?" So that's pretty, basic wiring for me. And then also I'm part of a family of builders. I represent, a 5-generation and going strong, business that started, by my great-great-grandfather back in the 1800s. And he started building roads when Henry Ford started building cars. And we've built lots of infrastructure over the last 131 years. And, we kind of look at the world as, in a way that, when you see a problem, go fix it. And particularly when you see an engineering or infrastructure problem that can clearly be fixed, and without fixing it, lots of damage is being done. You kind of, first of all, you can't unsee it once you've seen it, and secondly, I do have my mom's voice in the back, in the back of my head saying, "Get after it and fix it." So that's what kind of brings me, to the work. I've had all kinds of personal experiences with this that just validate the work, but I think that it's really seeing this broken internet and having some insight into how it can be fixed is really motivating to me right now.
You mentioned infrastructure, and there's all these different ways of thinking about what infrastructure is. And I know you've got experience not only with like physical infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, but also like media. And I'm curious how your thinking evolved over the past sort of few decades as you saw the internet emerging. Like, when did you start to think that maybe there's something that needs to be fixed, with this sort of new piece of vital infrastructure, and how did that emerge?
Yeah, infrastructure is, like you say, is a big, broad category, right? And there's all kinds of infrastructure. But maybe one way of thinking about it, Matt, is public versus private. And that's one way to to kind of slice it up and think about it. And we've done a good job in the United States, and not that people elsewhere haven't done a good job, but I'll focus on America for a moment, and a project, the American project, which is near and dear to me. We've done a reasonably good job of building public infrastructure and then letting private capital and private actors, entrepreneurs and so forth, build on it. And, a classic example that's used often is the interstate highway system, right? That massive project to, connect the country physically. And, so there's a shared resource funded by taxpayers, executed by the federal government in order to make us safer, quite frankly, right? So it had a defense purpose, i.e. the ability to move, machinery and men and women around the country. But it also had massive commercial purpose and opportunity. And then what we saw is all kinds of businesses build up, including the automobile business, by the way, but also, businesses that there's a reason why office parks get built around highway interchanges, and so on and so forth. Public transit is another great example, right, where the public sector builds it normally, and then you see, there's a reason why housing and commercial uses show up around subway stops, for instance, and transit stations. So, there's been this kind of public-private partnership, and I'm going to use that word loosely, over the years, where we've seen the public kind of do a lot of the policy thinking and the research, and then kind of build the enabling devices, and then the private sector kicks in. So, the internet, it was built the same way, right? I mean, it was a project initially started to make us safer, right? Because a highly centralized communication system is vulnerable to attack. And this was the mentality, during the Cold War. We didn't want to have our telecommunication systems be disabled by an attack from what was then the Soviet Union. And so the government set out to build a decentralized communication system, and brought really smart people in from 4 universities to figure out how to do that, and they created this thing called the internet. And in 1983, when it was agreed by those individuals that they would adopt a simple protocol to connect devices, the internet was created. It was highly decentralized by design, built as a public resource that everybody could use. And these researchers and universities continued to use it, but it was something that now the public could use and engage in. And then it was in 1989 when Tim Berners-Lee, an Englishman, came forward with further innovation with yet another protocol that called HTTP, which connected, it created data links. And so it was the creation of the World Wide Web, and also very decentralized, designed very much to to empower us, to empower individuals, and to make us smarter, and to share information and advance civilization. And it's that proverbial tide that lifts all boats. And then people started building on it. And where things went sideways, and I would argue even backward, is when we entered this age where this decentralized communications technology became highly centralized, with the rapid emergence of the app era, where these big apps showed up, which became these big platforms now, and they adopted let's scrape everybody's data and aggregate it and apply algorithms to it and do stuff to make money. And then, they learned they could do stuff to make money and actually influence, right, our behaviors and predict our behaviors and therefore influence them. And that's when we've got into like really dangerous territory, when you have these, a few big companies knowing more about each of us than we know about ourselves, making judgments about our personalities and what will be our emotional reaction to information or triggering devices, and having that power in the hands of a few platforms is very, very dangerous, in my opinion, particularly if your framework is, democracy, liberty, freedom, individual agency, autonomy, choice, individual control, and so forth. So we now have this highly autocratic, centralized, surveillance-based technology that's basically, as or more powerful than our political system, and which is designed to protect these liberties. And now we're seeing these liberties become diminished in this new age, because we're becoming subjects again, right? We're losing these freedoms and these rights to think freely and act freely and behave freely. So in 2013, set out to start a public policy school in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown, thinking at the time that maybe policy could be the answer to get out ahead of all this and fix it before it was too late. Big data was important, so we have a massive data institute that we placed inside of this new school, and learned very quickly, unfortunately, that policy was no match for the speed, the scale, the power, the money of big tech, and so started to think much more deeply about how to fix the tech or address the tech and have it operate in a way that's far more harmonious with the human rights that we, allegedly have, and that are, supposed to be protected by, our political order. So, yeah, it was really an awareness that this is tech that could do great damage, going back into the 2010-11 era, thinking it might be able to be fixed by, smarter policies, and then realizing by 2015 that we need to fix the tech.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but on the topic of infrastructure, I mean, one thing that strikes me is that if you think about public infrastructure that has worked and public infrastructure that hasn't worked, it seems to me that it's not always just about a simple sort of public-private distinction. It seems like basically there's certain kinds of big infrastructure projects, whether publicly or privately or both funded, they get captured, and some that don't, right? So for example, like the interstate highway system certainly benefited a number of large private businesses, more than the average person, but it was still somehow managed towards the public good and for the public benefit in a way that seemed to work for everyone. And there was never this kind of feeling of a very small number of businesses really extracting all of the value that network was creating. And the internet, I think you identified pretty much the same turning point that I would have identified, somewhere around that sort of app era transition, right? Maybe between kind of 2008 to 2012. It starts to feel extremely captured, right? It starts to feel that there are a handful of businesses that are really extracting most of the value and preventing the network as a whole from being managed in the public interest. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on, if you agree with that characterization first, and second, how do you think that capturing happened? What was the sort of door that was left unlocked that prevented that network from continuing to benefit the public the way prior big infrastructure projects have?
Yeah, I think that's a really a fantastic question, in that it gets to the root of the problem here. And before I answer it directly, let me add just two data points for you to see if you agree. In that 2008 to 2012 timeframe, in addition to these big apps showing up, their enabling device showed up, right? The smartphone. Right. And so now we're connecting everyone to this powerful, technology, and the app builders understood that they could use this device, right, in everybody's hands to actually connect to billions of people. So, and I'll get back to that in one moment. And secondly, and this is a stunner to me, when you start out building public infrastructure and something that's going to be for the public as well as to be private, to be commercial things being built around it, the public has a rationale for building it, and then businesses figure out models to then expand on it, right, and so forth. Like the telecom, we built a telecom company, my family starting in '93, and we raised the funds to build the fiber optic network throughout the country, and then built a better product so that we attracted customers that would pay us, so we could support the infrastructure we built. With the internet, it's been totally privatized, and yet somehow the public thinks that they still have the obligation of building it. So in this CHIPS Act, there's $50 billion to what? To build the final, most expensive parts of creating internet accessibility to the final 5 or 10% of the population. And here you have the biggest companies in the world that have exploited this public investment, still sitting back, letting our taxpayer dollars build the final mile for them, so that they can collect all the money, it's just absurd that we haven't shifted our mentality from, internet is good, it connects everyone, it makes us smarter, it's democratizing, let's use public resources, to whoops, somewhere along the way, all this was privatized, there's a few actors making all the money. Isn't that a problem, A? And B, why on earth would we pay taxpayer money to make them richer? It's just nuts. So maybe that's a conversation we can get back to later or for another day. But back to your issue about what happened, what's different about internet infrastructure and highway infrastructure, for example. And I think the big difference, Matt, is that the stuff that these platforms is scraping, all of our data, really is characterized. It's really not our data. It's our personhood in the digital age. It's everything about us. So, the highway system didn't scrape information. We chose to use it or didn't use it. And some highways we had to pay a toll because it was a public turnpike, and we had choice as to whether we had a car or not, and had choice as to whether we traveled on that highway or not. And we were never violated in the process, right? It wasn't that and now, ironically, on those same highways, we are being tracked, which is kind of the irony here. But the point, in answer to your question, is that what's fundamentally different about what's going on now is the information that is created, the product that's created by, connecting all of us, putting smartphones in our hands, having this internet backbone that is so powerful is that, what these big platforms figured out is it's not just data that's important. It's our personal data that's important, our social graph, a complete mapping, A, of society, and B, an incredibly intimate profiling of each of us. And this information, if we would never in a million years let our government surveil us and have all this information about us. But yet somehow we've been asleep at the switch as these big platforms have, scraped all of our data and just built these incredible surveillance tools that are just data extraction machines, and i.e. personhood extraction machines. So we're having the soul sucked out of us. People talk about tech as dehumanizing. Well, it certainly is. When you take and you suck the humanity out of us and ingest it in machines, and those machines are programmed to program us, right? Have you ever wondered why every argument seems to be like 50% on one side and 50% on the other side? It's because the algorithms are working perfectly well. They're designed to keep us at odds with one another, because that will keep us engaged longer. And not only will these platforms be able to sell us more stuff, they actually learn more about us. Because at this stage of the game, they have hundreds of thousands of data points on each of us. So they are micro-targeting us at this stage of the game and actually, as I said, making judgments about what makes us tick, who we are as human beings. And that's something the interstate highway system never did. You know what I mean? Or some of this other form of so it's the migration of the tech and the infrastructure to a tool of data extraction and surveillance and learning everything about us that is super creepy, actually. And, we see that happening in China, and we say, oh, yeah, China, that happens. I mean, like this whole TikTok discussion is kind of interesting, right? Because it's become a conversation about, TikTok extracts information about 170 million Americans. That's not good because that information is going to Beijing. What we need to do is connect some dots here. These American platforms are using the exact same model to collect data on all Americans and people elsewhere and using it to manipulate. So I get there's a difference between the data going to Beijing versus data going to Silicon Valley. But I don't know, you want all your data going to Silicon Valley? I don't want mine going there or Beijing. And that's what we need to do, I think, with this TikTok situation, is to get people to understand this is not about TikTok. Let me rephrase. This is about more than TikTok. This is about a surveillance model that extracts our personhood from us and is highly manipulative and highly dangerous. And that's what we need to be talking about. And that's the difference between this technology and how it's being used or abused and other forms of infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm curious whether you agree, but one way of thinking about it that seems kind of appealing to me is that I'm not sure, at least I can't actually draw like a perfectly clear distinction between the kind of, the sort of road network infrastructure sort of a thing and digital infrastructure network sort of a thing. Reason being that if you think about roads, like they also totally reshaped our lives, right? They reshaped the way people lived, they reshaped communities, they caused people to move quite quickly from sort of one way of life to another way of life because of the way they affected real estate prices. And, you've got the idea of the interstate, bypassing the old state highway town, right, which then dies over the next decade. And, those people were not compensated for the way that the interstate changed their lives. But it was, on the whole, pretty clearly managed in the public interest, even though it had all those kinds of, sometimes not so pretty and sometimes quite justly scrutinized collateral harms. Whereas, the degree to which the internet has been captured, it's being managed entirely for shareholder interests, right? There just seems to be a complete sort of lack of traction, and the transition from into data, right? The way that data is now in play as the sort of engine of the business model seems different, right? It penetrates into our lives in a way that is actually deeper than the way that the interstate highway reconfigured the way we live, right? So, I think that sometimes there are sort of step functions where these differences in degree, these can become sort of differences in kind. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the data business model and how you think that well, actually, let me pick up on one thing you said, which is the idea that we need to sort of fix it by innovating instead of regulation. So you mentioned that you mentioned that in 2013 you thought that policy might be the way to solve it, but that you now think we need to actually work sort of within the tech to change the dynamics of the internet. Well, I guess I have two questions about that. One question is that just because the tech lobby is too powerful, so it's not possible to get the legislation passed? Or is it because you think that there's actually work that we can do in the technology itself that is the sort of shortest route to a better digital infrastructure? And one sort of comment I want to put in the background of the question is, I sometimes reflect on the fact that these kinds of exploitative digital business models, they didn't emerge in Europe. I think that's interesting, actually, right? I think it's interesting that, and if you'd gone back 15 years, everybody in Europe would have said, oh my God, what can we do to create the next Silicon Valley? And now here we are thinking, maybe there was actually some wisdom in whatever they were doing to not create Silicon Valley, right? But I'm just curious what you think, why you think regulation is not part of the solution now, or if it is, to what extent, and what can we actually do within technology to improve the dynamics?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that regulation isn't part of the solution. What I meant to say is that regulation isn't the solution in its entirety, and it's no match for the power of the technology. A couple of things that were triggered by your last, the comments you made before this particular question about, interstate highway had lots of impacts on society, right? And industry and so forth. Probably had no bigger impact than on. There's probably nothing that it had no bigger impact on than the railroad industry, right?
Right.
In terms of displacement and dislocation, and we saw the complete reshaping of that industry. But maybe a better analogy is the emergence of television, because at least with physical infrastructure, and I know there's a lot of controversy around eminent domain practices and so on and so forth, taking private property for a public purpose, but at least people have to be paid for their property, right? There's an understanding that's quite fundamental that if I'm going to take somebody's property to build a highway, I'm going to have to pay them for it, right? And have good reason, by the way, after going through public hearings and lots of scrutiny and so on and so forth. So let's talk about TV broadcast for a second. So TV comes on. This is public bandwidth, airwaves, owned by all of us. So who are you going to compensate? All right. So instead, the federal government wisely said, we're going to license the bandwidth for a period of time to entities that are responsible and agree to the terms of the license and abide by the rules. And so, TV comes along and 3 licenses are granted, and those, that becomes ABC, CBS, and NBC, and all kinds of things are imposed upon them. That you got to provide public service announcements. You got to air presidential debates. You can't have ads that are harmful to children. And so on and so forth. And by the way, we're going to keep bandwidth back and hold it in the public domain for public broadcasting, because we actually don't know what the impacts on children of this new technology are going to be. So, we're going to create something called the Children's Workshop, and we're going to actually research the impacts on children while we're broadcasting to them. And so Sesame Street, which is, when my older kids were growing up, was something that was very prevalent. And, I didn't hesitate to have my kids watch Sesame Street because I knew there were people paying attention to the impacts on my kids and other kids, based on that technology. And we learned a lot before we allowed the business to grow and so on and so forth. And so when you're talking about privatizing a public resource that nobody owns, but everybody owns, it's very different than a piece of real estate to build a piece of physical infrastructure. So that might be a better analogy than the interstate highways. And then, think about now the internet as bandwidth that's being, used for, theoretically public purposes and to enable some private businesses and all that. But the change, the fundamental change here was in creating devices, apps that were it was building machinery to scrape people's data and information. And by the way, this isn't just on smartphones, right? We are all connected to the internet now 24/7, the so-called Internet of Things. Even our refrigerator and our dishwasher is collecting information about us. Our cars are smartphones on wheels. Our televisions are really just, they're data extraction machines. We walk down city streets, we're surveilled. Our little camera that's watching our newborn child is a data extraction machine. Our doorbell is. Have you ever wondered, Matt, why, if you separate goods and services and consumer products into 2 categories, the things that people really need to live a good, safe, healthy, happy life are much, much more expensive, like housing, food, healthcare, education, etc. And the things that collect our data are much, much more cheaper than they were before, right? Televisions. You could buy a television and fill a whole wall of your house for what a television cost that was the size of this iPad I'm on. Phones. They give phones away now, right? All these devices that collect our data, the cost of the device is incidental. The value is what it's collecting about us and then being exploited. So that's what's happened. That's what's different. So, and as I said earlier, it's not just data. A lot of people, when you have this conversation, they say data, it's a benign thing, it's abstract. What is it really? No. The data we're talking about is our social graph information. It's everything about us in the digital world. So it's our digital DNA. It's our identity. It's who we are. It's every bit as real as our biological DNA, which, by the way, is digitized now, right? So why on earth would we give up everything about us, our personhood, just to get to use the internet? Should we have an internet that actually is designed to optimize for our rights and so forth? And we don't need a digital Bill of Rights. We need technology that respects the Bill of Rights that we already have. And this is, I think, fundamental to, we're at this fork in the road where we're either going to be dragged into a future by the machinery. And it's interesting that we're still a machine on the internet, right? We're still an IP address. We're not a person. Or we're going to actually reclaim our personhood, and we're going to put ourselves in charge of our life in the digital age and have technology that respects that. So your point about policies will be important. There's no question about it. But the point I was making earlier is the policy-making apparatus, especially our elected officials, are also disabled and dysfunctional because of the same technology. They're using it, right, to extreme viewpoints, raises money and gives them likes and followers. Look at any politician that's reasonable and moderate, and you'll see they just don't get the attention. The technology is designed, it's a performance technology that's designed to actually amplify extreme and behavior, which has no bearing on the truthfulness of it. It's just extreme, kind of behavior. And it's the same, reason why people slow down on the highway and look at the bad accident to cross on the other lane, going the other direction. It's just, there's a curiosity about it. So people pay attention to this extreme stuff. It's kind of hardwired, and these platforms know it, so they've baked it into their technology and their algorithms. And now we see that they actually are preying on young people and addicting young people to this technology. And unlike television and Sesame Street and the Children's Workshop, this is, where, by the way, if 1 million people watched an episode on television in its early days, never mind 1 million children, it would have been a huge audience. Now we have billions connected on this much more powerful technology. And we're beginning to talk about privacy and beginning to talk about safety and beginning to talk about trust and beginning to talk about the impact on society and democracy and children. It's too late to talk about it when 3 billion people are using it. The time to talk about it is when you're designing it. So this, sadly, we have contaminated the soil that this technology is grown out of, and we need to clean the soil or find new soil and build a healthy stuff that can grow out of it, and not kid ourselves and think we're going to just, regulate something that is doing great harm and is highly toxic and so forth. So I think we need to fix this in a very, very fundamental way. Your point about Europe is very interesting. How many times have you heard that, American innovates and Europe regulates? To me, that's a tremendous talk track if you're big tech.
Right.
Just make everybody think the regulators are, the European mentality is like somehow they're not with it. They don't get it, right? And I spend a lot of time here, and Project Liberty is also based in Europe as well as the US. And these people in Europe, they get it fundamentally. They care deeply about privacy and protecting people. And they have good reason to, because many of them have lived through the 30s and the 40s, where they saw what happens and how democracies do fall, and how autocratic behavior can destroy, if not checked, democracies, and can do it very quickly. Autocratic technology, it will be the greatest tool of autocrats ever. So right. we either have to re-decentralize the technology and have it optimized for democratic principles and human rights, in order to, so have our technology adapt and bend to the will of the democratic, to the ambition of the democratic principles and the will of the people. Or guess what? Our democratic system is going to bend and alter itself to become highly autocratic and bend to the technology. They're not harmonious. In China, right. Autocratic technology is a very powerful tool for an autocratic regime, an autocratic form of government. So, I think that we can learn a lot from the Europeans. Of course, they're stuck because they have GDPR and DMA and DSA, and they've made their public policy objectives very clear, but they don't have technology to implement those policies. So it's, in a way, they're telegraphing the right set of principles, generally speaking. And I'm not saying I've read every word of every rule or regulation and adopt all of them, but generally they're very focused on protecting human beings and our rights, but they don't have the technology to do it. So they're stuck with begging, Facebook and Google and Amazon, et cetera, to and now Apple and Microsoft to actually respect their rules and their laws. And big tech, kind of, euphemistically kind of just laughs because it's so right. powerful. Matt, the technology is so, literally, imagine we're all connected and surveilled. Look, if I was the head of the post office and I said to you, I have an idea, I'm going to deliver your mail for free, you probably, say, well, tell me, what's the deal? Well, I'm going to put a listening device and a camera in every room in your house and in your car and in your workplace and so forth. You'd probably look at me and say, well, that's creepy, and I said, well, it's free. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to open your mail and I'm going to read it all. And now your relationships are mine. Your ideas are mine. Your thoughts are mine. Your emotions are mine. Everything about you is now mine. You'd say, that's not fair. It's both creepy and unfair. And then when I add that I'm going to read your 13-year-old daughter's diary, and when she's a little, she's insecure like every 13-year-old, and in this particular case, by way of example, maybe it's her weight. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send her stuff that makes her feel worse, not better. And then I'm going to sell her stuff. And so I'm going to profit on that, exploitive behavior and that in being predatory and so forth. So it's creepy, it's unfair, and it's harmful. And that's toxic soil, right? Yeah. That is, you can't just regulate that. You need to thoroughly clean that soil or build on fresh soil. Yeah.
So, one metaphor here, which I'm curious what you think about this, is, if you look at other, I like to look at history. I always like to sort of find historical comparisons, try to, I think in a way there's, things change, but in a way there's nothing new, and it's often useful to kind of orient ourselves, figure out what we can learn from the past. And one thing that I notice here is, if you think about other times in history when lots of people have been kind of trapped in sort of a, dehumanizing, exploitative kind of industrial structures, solidarity has always been important, right? So for example, if you think about the early 20th century, you had lots of people in exploitative labor relationships, right? Whose humanity was being sort of degraded in a way that is, not the same, but sort of analogous to the way that, to the way that our relationship with our digital services, basically. And and at that time, how did it's not, the problems don't get solved, they get mitigated, right? And so how did that problem get mitigated? It got mitigated partly through regulation, but also partly through labor, right? Through like labor organization and sort of collective bargaining. So to me, like that pattern seems to have some applicability to the moment that we're in now, which is why when I think about the data problem, I'm very interested in thinking about structures of collective organization around data. In other words, and this is not to the exclusion of sort of individual data rights, because we have to have individual data rights to have anything to collectively organize around, right? So the two are related. But I think that, for example, well, one thing is that the problem is in a way more difficult today. The problem of sort of, gaining leverage over these systems through data is more difficult today than the labor problem was, because it's almost more unclear today what we're organizing around, right? 100 years ago, it was like the people in the factory, right, have aligned interests. That's the organized unit that should be, finding solidarity and asserting its interests. Today, it's sort of like everyone. It's like these sort of just, chaotic sort of overlapping classes and groups and social networks and social graphs. It's like we all sort of, we're having trouble sort of recognizing ourselves, like who are we that need to do a better job advocating for our interests in our information. So I'm curious what you think first about the sort of collective bargaining sort of framing around data, and just whether that analogy makes sense to you.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And you could go, back to the 19th century and talk about slavery too, right? It's exploiting a class of people or a group of people. And in the 20th century, when slavery had been banned, there was still exploitation, right? And a lot of that exploitation was children and women, and you had movements to create laws and so on and so forth. What's interesting is, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out, and what is required obviously is a movement of some sort to fix this, because that's what changed, and brought new laws forward, outlawing slavery and new laws forward outlawing, child labor and exploiting women and exploiting any of us. I mean, there were, unions and rules regarding, all forms of labor. What's really, I think, insightful about your question is that we are all producing now the currency for these big platforms. The data we produce individually, and the more time we're connected, the more data we produce, is the bounty for these few platforms. But when I said earlier, it's going to be very interesting to see how this movement plays out, rather than, there were lots of businesses that resisted a change in our laws about slavery, right? It so much so that we had a civil war, right? There were lots of businesses that were, against a change in labor laws, right? There are very few businesses right now that are benefiting in the same way as the big five. And we're all being exploited. That to me is why I say it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out, because yes, you're right. we need a movement. Yes, you're right. We're going to need fundamental change, and that will require new laws and new policies, and especially new tech, which actually connects each one of us to our data and gives us agency over how it's used. I mean, we need an internet where the new apps are clicking on our terms of use for our data, and we're not clicking on the terms of use of 3, 4, 5 platforms. So it's quite clear what we need, and the tech is doable. Project Liberty has put forward a solution with another thin layer protocol called DSNP, which would give us all agency over our data. And that is, we have to remember these protocols at the bottom of the stack are what enables the whole stack that gets built upon it, right? So just as the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights are, relatively speaking, very thin layer documents. They don't embody everything. They're prescriptive. They say, here are the ideals and the principles that we're all agreeing to. TCP/IP, HTTP, DSNP, these are thin layer protocols that are saying, here are the ideals, values, principles that we're all agreeing to. Now build accordingly. And that's clearly what we need. Look, it's been 41 years since the internet was created. Why are we still a device on the internet? Why aren't we a person on the internet? Why can't we have verifiable human beings using the internet so we know that there's accountability, there's a privilege for using it? It's not something to be, have machine bots just spewing, whatever they want to corrupt our information landscape. Because, any foreign actor knows you corrupt the information ecosystem of a country, you have corrupted that country. You've disabled it. Because everything we build in the world of value is built on trust. You destroy trust, you destroy the political system. You destroy trust, you destroy the economic system. You destroy trust, there's no way institutions can function without trust. There's no way individuals can function with one another without trust. That's why, when we created a set of human rights in this country, we married it with a social contract that said, for these rights to matter, you have to respect them in other people. And so that's the bargain. That's the bargain. And without that bargain, what we have is one of two things: anarchy or autocracy, where you have dictatorships, autocrats, authoritarians telling everybody, what the rules are and punishing people if they don't obey, particularly if they're doing things that are going to reduce the power of the centralized force. So, this isn't just me saying it. I mean, this is history of humankind. So if we want our great experiment in the US to continue and to be that, that inspiration and that source of hope for lots of people around the world, we have to understand what makes it work fundamentally. A few simple concepts, and have technology that embraces those concepts and is actually subordinate to the concepts, right? The technology should be optimizing for that, not optimizing for, something that's entirely different. How do we say with a straight face to people that we're protecting your rights when you have no rights, on the internet today? Everything about us is being stolen from us. I know the lawyers will say you clicked on that to get used to the app. And I say that's all BS. It's total BS. It's like me saying, I own this slave because I have a contract. No. There is a moral law that is far greater and more important than any law that man creates. And that's what created the country. It was created by people saying, we're not going to be subjects anymore. We choose to be citizens. We choose to create that category, that status for us to live our lives as equals with other people, self-governed. We can build a government and of, by, and for people. And we can build it on a set of principles where humans have dignity, right? They own themselves. They're no longer owned by a king or by a dictator or by, any autocrat. And that's the simple thing. It's like a light bulb went off for Thomas Paine when he wrote Common Sense, right? And for the American public saying, wow, I never thought of that. I never thought I could actually own me. I thought, because we lived in a world of, monarchies and so on and so forth for 6, 7, 8, 900 centuries, that's all they knew, right? And so they didn't. It took someone to say, no, it doesn't have to be this way. And now this technology has put us into a place of, it's almost like we're living in this haze, where we've been brainwashed by this tech that it's this wonderful thing, empowering thing. When if we just have a wind that blew away the haze and we saw it for what it is, it's actually taking everything we love away from us.
Yeah.
How is it that technology, these platforms should know more about our kids than we do as parents? It's insidious.
It's very powerful to hear you talk about moral rights like that, because partly because I live in the haze of my lawyer brain. I'm always going to sort of, okay, but then how do we codify it? What is it exactly? How are we exactly going to embody this kind of right or that kind of right? And I think that when the thinking of people like me and probably other people too kind of shifts too quickly into that mode, we miss the point that you're making right now, right? Which is that there's an underlying moral idea that is meant here when we're talking about data ownership that actually carries a lot more weight than the sort of legal concept of ownership. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, I use that analogy of televisions, this great, advance in technology. What if it came with, it was actually a device that went into all of our homes and surveilled us and captured every moment of our physical existence, and in our house, in our most private places. And all that information was going to the government. So somebody sat there and sucked up all that information and said, geez, I just heard a conversation with, in Matt's family or Frank's family where they're against me. So send out people to punish them, for being against, because we want to, kill our enemies within. History shows us that the enemy outside is less harmful than the enemy inside. And yes, TikTok is bad, but we have an apparatus to deal with China, a whole apparatus to defend ourselves from China. We have no apparatus to defend ourselves from all these platforms that are killing us from inside. And this is a huge, huge problem that's fixable, thankfully. Okay, it is fixable. And we just have to get people thinking differently about this and not going into their lawyer brain or not going into their it can't be fixed brain,
right,
or their genie is out of the bottle brain, but go into the brain, part of the brain that is about the reimagining the future. It's the imagination part of the brain. Go there and say, okay, somebody reimagined things in 1775 and we could become citizens instead of being subjects. So let's reimagine technology where we are citizens again and we're not becoming subjects just to be able to use the internet.
I think that is a great place to close. Thank you so much for the I mean, I've got, if there's anything else you want to touch on, we can do it. But that was a beautiful closing.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your questions, because they were really good questions, because you opened a series of doors that made it very, very easy and natural for me to tell a story. And I could see your mind working as you were asking questions. So I'm very, very appreciative of that and impressed.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was a pleasure. Thanks for doing it. And we'll talk again soon.
Look forward to it. You take care of yourself.
Thanks again to Matt Prewitt and Frank McCourt. The Radical Exchanges podcast is executive produced by G. Angela Corpus and Matt Prewitt, and is code-produced and audio engineered by myself, Aaron Benavides. This episode was produced and recorded by Matt Prewitt. If you would like to learn more about Radical Exchange, please follow us on Twitter @RadXchange or check out our website at radicalexchange.org. And if you'd like to join in the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So hop on our Discord, where we have channels discussing topics like what you heard today, as well as topics like plural voting, community currencies, soulbound tokens, and more. There will be links for all of these in the description. Have a great day and stay radical.